Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks. Welcome to Kansas City Public Library. I'm Cresby Kemper, the director. We're glad you're here for Adrian Goldsworthy and talking about Rome and its decline and fall. The Kansas City Public Library is at the moment on the rise, so you're not the decline and fall. Though, after reading this wonderful book about that talks so much about civil war, poisonings of emperors, the Praetorian Guards taking over, I have to announce tonight that I've arrested Henry Fortunato, and I need volunteers from the audience to taste my food. Anyway, thank you all very much for being here. This book, How Rome Fell, which is a wonderful book, like Adrian Goldsworthy's biography of Caesar, which has also been widely and justifiably praised, is great narrative history. And Adrian Goldsworthy makes the point in the book that we've had to rescue many topics of history, like the decline and fall of Rome, from the social and economic historians whose frameworks are completely different, and who I think, and I believe he believes, have lost the sense of the contingency of history. I mean, what does it matter that there was a civil war here or there, or an emperor was poisoned, or the greatest challenge to Rome came internally or externally, as long as we know how straight the roads were. And I think this book is a great corrective and part of a wave of narrative history that's come to us from some great historians like Adrian Goldsworthy. He has, as I said, written the biography of Caesar, which was a New York Times notable book, and won the Society of Military History's Distinguished Book Award for biography. He's working now on a TV series with National Geographic called Rome Unwrapped. Is that Rome Unwrapped? And you'll get to see that sometime next year, I think, in which he'll be the star of a number of episodes. And that will be a great pleasure to see. The thing that I take away from this book, he talks about, and he will talk to you about, and you'll get to hear him explain this, but not me, about a lot of different ideas and different reasons that Rome might have fallen. But one of the phrases and he quotes Gibbon with what may be the best view of this is it may not be. What's surprising may not be that Rome fell, but how long it lasted. But the thing that I take away is a great phrase he uses about Rome's sense of purpose and the res publica, the public thing. That the Romans had this idea of Rome, and even through the early civil wars of the Republican period and the early days of the empire, they maintained this idea of Rome. And the thing that changes the most over time is the idea of Rome becomes less and less important, and the narrow personal thing becomes more and more important. And I think that's a great lesson to take. And whether that's a lesson for today or not, I leave to him and to you. But this is a stunningly excellent book, and we're really proud to have Adrian Goldsworthy here.
Well, thank you very much for the library for inviting me here, and for everybody for coming. I hope I live up to that introduction. Obviously, this is one of the great themes of history, but let's begin with one specific incident and one specific individual before we talk about some of the grander concepts, the big sweep, perhaps some of the underlying causes. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor to rule anywhere in Italy was deposed. He wasn't ruling from Rome. No emperor had spent much time in Rome for several generations. They'd moved up, first of all, to Milan, and then when Milan wasn't safe enough anymore, they'd moved to Ravenna, which was pretty much surrounded by marshes, hard to get at. They'd moved somewhere safe. They didn't feel secure anywhere else. So you have a Roman emperor who rules in Italy not in Rome. And he doesn't rule much more than Italy by this time. The empire has shrunk, it is extremely small. He's called Romulus Augustulus. He is only a teenager, not very important, hasn't achieved anything, hasn't done anything, but his father happens to be the commander of the previous emperor's army and decides that that emperor isn't really very good, so rebels against him, gets rid of him, appoints his son as a puppet ruler. He doesn't consider himself suitable to be emperor, but he wants someone he can control utterly as a figurehead for the new regime. Now, Romulus Augustulus wasn't recognized at all by the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which has been a separate entity for nearly 100 years. So you have a long succession of emperors ruling from Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. They don't recognize Romulus Augustulus. He's the rebel, he's the usurper, he isn't the legitimate emperor. But of course, once you've got to power by causing a mutiny in the army, there's very little to prevent somebody else doing the same thing. And Romulus Augustulus is emperor for less than a year before officers subordinate to his father turn against his father. They kill the father. But what's quite significant is that the boy isn't even worth the trouble of killing. He just isn't important enough. They give him a nice, comfortable villa somewhere, send him off there, live out the rest of your life. You simply don't matter. And he isn't even worth replacing. He's not worth killing, he's not worth replacing. The new commander of the army decides that he can simply rule as a military strongman. He doesn't need an emperor. He doesn't need to make himself emperor. They actually send the regalia of imperial rule back to Constantinople, say, look, we don't need these anymore. It's not our problem. So it's an event, and it's a slightly strange one, and it didn't really have very much impact outside Ravenna itself. Even within Italy, many people probably weren't too aware that the last emperor had gone, because the empire has shrunk so much, it has become very insignificant. But there's obviously a heavy irony in the names that this boy was given as ruler. Romulus, of course, the mythical founder of Rome. You know, Romulus and Remus, suckled by the she-wolf, all that business. Augustus was the first emperor, adopted son of Julius Caesar. You know, we're coming up to Christmas, not too many months' time, and people will be reading out that, and a decree went out for Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Well, it's that fella, the first emperor. But this is Augustulus. That's the diminutive form, little Augustus. You know, it's a nickname. They're not even taking him too seriously. He's trying to be the great man, but even in the brief time he was emperor, people couldn't really treat him too seriously. So there's a heavy irony in this last moment. And you are dealing with, in a sense, the last moment of an extremely long history. Romulus may or may not have existed. We don't know much about that early period. But Rome probably was founded as a community in about the 8th century BC, which is the mythical date. That's when the Romans thought their city began. In the end of the 6th century, it becomes a republic. For 500 years, Rome is a republic, and it's as the republic that it overruns Italy, it conquers the Mediterranean, it expands before it tears itself apart in the series of civil wars that Julius Caesar played a major role in. And Augustus brings those to an end by simply being the last man standing and creates the system of rule by emperors, the Principate, something we'll come back to in a moment. That lasts for just over 2 centuries, nearly 2.5, before it changes into something else. Augustus was the princeps, the first. The idea was that he was the first citizen, the first magistrate of the Republic. Not its master, but a servant. Someone who worked on behalf of the greater state. And he was primus inter pares, first among equals. The imagery, even though this is the man who controlled the Roman army, so, you know, you couldn't argue with him too much, and even though he wasn't voted into power, he seized it through civil war, he pretended to be a legitimate servant of the state, and he worked on behalf of the state. Augustus would walk through the streets of Rome when he was going to meetings of the Senate. He was visible, people could approach him, they could petition him. If someone was distinguished enough when they came into the imperial presence, if you were another senator, if you were an important foreign delegate, the emperor might well rise from his seat to greet you as a mark of honor. He might well shake you by the hand. He is princeps, he is the first, but he is simply the first citizen. He is still a citizen like everybody else. That's the ideal. But by the 3rd century, things change. Emperors then cease to be princeps. They become instead dominus. That word means master. It's what a slave would call his or her owner. Later on, of course, Dominus will be adopted by the church. It's the word for Lord. When you were ushered into the presence of an emperor from the late 3rd century onwards, he wasn't going to rise up and take you by the hand. You had to prostrate yourself on the ground. At various stages, if you were particularly favored, you might get to kiss the jeweled sandals he was wearing or kiss the hem of his robe. But he is kept very separate. There's a famous account of an emperor in the 4th century riding into Rome and keeping his head rigidly looking forward and slightly upwards, completely ignoring the crowd that's around him, even though they're cheering. And in one of those strange little sidelines that you get that tells you an awful lot about culture that you wouldn't normally mention, it's also highlighted the fact that he didn't scratch or pick his nose as he went along in his triumphal chariot being led into the city amongst the cheering crowd. So it's a very distant figure. The emperor is next to God, is perhaps in some cases divine himself. They're removed. They are definitely the master of the state, not one of its servants, not simply its most distinguished citizen. And during the 3rd century, the empire changes. By the end of the 3rd century, it becomes common for there to be more than one emperor at any time. There's a system called the tetrarchy, which is the rule of 4, but it doesn't actually last for anywhere near as long as people tend to claim. And emperors are much more active. They don't spend time in Rome very much at all. They tend to move around from province to province, from problem to problem. They lead their armies in person. They are extremely active in a way that was not common much earlier. There's also another problem that we'll return to again and again in the talk this evening, and that's civil war that's already been mentioned. From 217 AD onwards, civil war is extremely common within Roman society, and we'll see just how frequent it was a little bit later. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire divides into two. You have two Roman empires, an eastern and a western half. Different lines of emperors ruling each one, different administrations, different army commands. People very rarely move from one command structure to the other. But they still remain culturally the same. The laws are the same. They are not competitors either economically or militarily. There are simply two Roman empires coexisting. The Western Empire will fall by stages. It will lose province after province until eventually you get to Romulus Augustulus and it just disappears, but it's so insignificant by that time that people hardly notice. The Eastern Empire survives. It will survive until the 15th century when the Ottoman Turks storm Constantinople and the last emperor is removed. But perhaps the most famous thing about the Roman Empire is that it fell. You know, the famous Roman has got to be Julius Caesar. Everybody knows the name Caesar. They have some rough idea. They might think he's a Roman emperor, which, well, he wasn't really technically, but they have some idea. There's immediate recognition. And the other thing that people know about the empire is that it fell. And of course, since Gibbon, if English is your first language, or if you are aware of that, you are likely to think not just of fall, but decline and fall. That phrase, those few words, are so deeply embedded in our consciousness that they spring to the tongue of a journalist, politician, anyone commentating on any institution, any country, any individual that's got problems. We readily talk about decline and fall. It's a natural thing. Gibbon's history was, of course, a great classic of not just history writing, but also of English literature. It is quite a remarkable achievement of scholarship and of writing when you look at it today. And there aren't too many 18th century histories that are still permanently in print and so widely read. It's big. Not many people get to read all of it too often, but nevertheless, they're aware of Gibbon, even if they haven't read him. And it's quite an interesting book, looking even at the nature of it itself. The first volume was released early on in 1776, just a few months before the Declaration of Independence. Gibbon was an MP who'd voted supporting the government to send more troops the year before to help suppress the rebellion of the colonists. By the time the last volumes come out, it's 1778, and things have all gone horribly wrong as far as the British are concerned. There is a new country. The United States now exists. And Gibbon's tone becomes more and more pessimistic as he goes on. It's actually part of that is the nature of his times. There's that sense of worry of, does this mean the end of the British Empire? Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the Victorian age is still to come. The height of the British Empire has not yet happened. It's going to get bigger, it's going to get more successful. But that wasn't too obvious in the late 1780s, particularly when you start getting the outbursts of revolution in France and elsewhere. But somehow it's also the nature of the topic. I mean, I found it a little bit writing this book. You do tend to get steadily more and more depressed as you go on, because it's quite a grim story. And you sort of think, oh, well, they're not really learning much from this, are they? But there's another thing that people know about Rome that probably follows on from decline and fall, and that highlights the importance of that and why it was so dramatic. And that's the sheer success of Rome. Rome comes across as a very modern state. Sometimes this is an aspect of technology. We look at the Roman Empire and you can see a system of all-weather roads that would not be equaled anywhere till the late 19th century, and in many countries would not be matched until the 20th century. You have a system where you've got underfloor heating in your houses. You've got glass in the windows. You've got the bathhouse. It's one of the most complicated pieces of engineering that the Romans develop. And yet the bathhouse is purely there to make your life more comfortable. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't do anything very essential, but it makes life nicer. And it tells you a lot about the level of prosperity in a society if they can afford to devote huge resources to comfort or to entertainment. I mean, something else everybody knows about Rome is going to be gladiators, and Hollywood has this strange obsession that virtually every epic or any drama set in the Roman period, there'll be a gladiator there somewhere. But when you think of the sheer cost of bringing animals from all over the world, or all over the known world, to be slaughtered in the arena, of building something like the Colosseum that could seat 50 to 55,000 people, the center of Rome, Circus Maximus could probably seat 250,000 to watch chariot racing. The sheer quantities of money that are spent on entertainment give you an idea of the levels of prosperity. Very few societies have been able to do this until the modern era. So again, it makes the Romans very modern. And the contrast is with what follows. After Rome, you have what used to be known as the Dark Ages. You have a much more primitive system. States get smaller. Life expectancy is probably less. That's arguable. Things are a lot more primitive. Things seem a lot more violent. There is not the literacy. Literature is not produced in similar quantities. So it doesn't look, when you examine this, as if progress that we tend to assume is a rather natural thing is perhaps as inevitable or as natural as all that. You have a clear sense of things getting worse. Again, no coincidence that one of Churchill's most famous speeches in 1940 talked about the threat of the Nazis as, if they win, would introduce a new dark age. And it didn't do any harm for Churchill that obviously it was the German barbarians that had rushed across the Rhine and helped to knock down the Roman Empire. But nevertheless, it's that sense that civilization can end, that an advanced, sophisticated, prosperous society can be replaced by something a lot more primitive, a lot less pleasant, a lot less comfortable. Things can get worse. So obviously this is one of the great questions of history, and lots of people have tried to answer it. Gibbon is only perhaps the most famous. A few years back, one German scholar did, in a very Teutonic way, but also very much tongue-in-cheek, he produced this catalogue, an alphabetical list of 200 different reasons put forward for why the Roman Empire fell. And they range from the sort of down-and-out wacky, like the one that was quite fashionable a few years ago, that it was the Romans used lead water pipes, so they all died of lead poisoning. Quite see the logic of that one. You also see that each generation tends to see its own fears, its own threats reflected in Rome's history. So the last few decades, it's been quite common to look at climatic change. People have suggested that perhaps there was a drop in temperature. They connect it to volcanic eruptions in Indonesia that threw dust into the air and all this sort of thing. Other people talk about rising sea levels elsewhere. The big problem they face with all these theories is that they have no evidence, but, that doesn't really bother a lot of people. But nevertheless, it's a reflection of what we're worried about. You look at the Romans. People claim that Gibbon sees Christianity as a bad thing and blames the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire as a major cause of this. He doesn't actually, if you read what he says. He's extremely cynical about the development of the church, and he gets off a lot of good one-liners, but he doesn't really In fact, he doesn't really give any particular reason. Gibbon was very much a narrative historian. He told the story. And he does, the closest he comes is when he says that the decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Rome was simply so big, so successful, that it just collapsed under its own weight. But he doesn't really explain why this should happen. It's merely saying that, well, as mentioned earlier, we ought to be surprised it lasted so long. The Romans themselves did feel that things were getting worse, but then the Romans had always felt things were getting worse. It's a constant theme of Roman literature that we're not quite the men our fathers were, let alone our grandfathers. There's a slightly sort of depressed but determined instinct about the Romans, and them sort of trudging along but feeling that everything's going to hell around them, but, we better keep going. Even when occasionally you get these periods of optimism, but is very much a sense that the golden age is past, and that's really true even at the height of the Roman Empire. But back in the later, say in the 4th century and the 5th, you will get authors who will blame the decline of Rome on Christianity. You'll get Christian authors who will blame it on the pagans. And people have done the same thing more recently. And when all's said and done, if in doubt, blame the Germans. A lot of barbarians do force their way into the empire. You've got people like the Franks, a group of tribes who will move into what was then Gaul, and obviously that's where the name France comes from. You've got Goths in Spain, in Italy, you've got the Vandals in North Africa, you've got Attila and the Huns, all these other groups that are blamed, but the vast bulk of them were German-speaking barbarian tribes. And then there's a big debate over whether it's internal reasons, does Rome rot from the inside, or is it external threats? Are those barbarians just far more formidable than the other tribes that have been living outside the Roman Empire for as long as it's existed, than the sort of Germans that Julius Caesar fought against? Are they more dangerous? One French scholar put it this way: the Roman Empire didn't die, it was assassinated. And obviously at one basic level, he's right. The Romans were attacked by various groups like the Goths. They were attacked by the Huns. These barbarian kingdoms are created throughout the Western Empire. That's what's carved up the empire that Romulus Augustulus inherited. So the question, though, remains, is that are they able to do that because they're so much more formidable, they're so much stronger, or can they do it because Rome is so much weaker and less capable of resisting? And again, because of this tendency to go back to Rome as the ultimate empire, the ultimate power in world history, not only does each age reflect its own fears, they also compare the great power of their own day, inevitably is talked about as today's Rome. I was giving this talk 100 years ago, then probably the British Empire would be the force we'd look at. Then it would control about a quarter of the globe. It was big, it was powerful, people were boasting the sun never set on it, and all this sort of thing. Nowadays, it is very common for people to talk about America as the new Rome. You get, there was a book a few years back, Are We Rome? You get documentaries on it, you get journalists talking about it. There's a certain sort of literary party that unfortunately I have to go to now and again in London. And whenever anyone finds out you're an ancient historian, they sort of sidle up and tell you that, America's the new Rome. And then they sort of whisper as if they're being frightfully clever, but they don't see it. Which shows the level of ignorance, because if you go back, when you think, look at the Founding Fathers, and all of these people were steeped in the classics. And they very consciously set out to create a republic that would be Roman but better than Rome. This was a Roman republic that would not descend into monarchy. Washington was praised because he was not Caesar. Caesar refused to resign power. Washington decided that his political career would end. And that was, people were talking about this at the time. This was a very conscious thing because all these people, they knew the classics very strongly and they looked to Rome as a model, hence the fact there's a Senate. Little things like that ought to give you a clue. So it isn't a new thing. And I've taken part in, I've written papers and taken part in seminars for things for the armed forces and for the government, where people today are trying to learn direct lessons from the Roman experience. So Rome comes back as a theme time and again. More recently for scholars, there's been a trend away from decline and fall. That's rather a bad thing. And we don't want to say nasty things about the Germans or the barbarians. We don't want to say that these kingdoms are somehow inferior. We don't want to criticize people. And because, as mentioned before, there's been particularly fashionable in a lot of study of the ancient world, a focus on social issues, on philosophy, on religion, on spirituality, on all these things. If you look at themes like that, then there isn't a clear break between before Rome falls and afterwards. You know, many trends that are developing in the 4th century are still there in the 6th or 7th and beyond, and you can see a clear link between them. So for many scholars, it's fashionable to talk about transformation. You don't have fall, you don't have decline. The empire simply transforms into the early medieval world, because you don't have the Dark Ages anymore. You know, that's bad, that's offensive. We don't want to upset the Vikings or anything like that. The other thing is, we now have the early medieval period. And one of the most fundamental reasons for this, and it does make some sense, but there's a very practical reason, is that medieval history has been quite fashionable for a few decades, and there's a lot of money in it. So if you want a decent budget, you become an early medieval department, and you're more likely to do quite well, especially in Britain, that's true. They've been popping up everywhere. So again, it's emphasis on just how sophisticated this era is. Now, it's a terrific thing that people have gone to those centuries and said, well, look, there is evidence there. These aren't completely dark. Let's make the most of what we've got. And it's also a good thing that people have looked at the social history. They've looked at the spirituality, ideology, all these things. These are worth studying, but these aren't the only things that should be studied. If the narrative history, if the political history drops out of the loop, then suddenly you don't have a context for any of this. And that's unfortunately what has happened. A few people have criticized the approach. They've emphasized that, well, look, you know, something bad did occur. Rome did fall. We're not all speaking Latin today. We're not all Roman, you know. Something's gone on. But they're very much isolated voices. And there were a couple of very good books published a few years back, one by Brian Ward Perkins and another by Peter Heather, that looked at the period. And Ward Perkins emphasized the sheer contrast, just in lifestyle, in levels of comfort, prosperity, between the Roman Empire and what follows. Even down to simple things, that in the Roman period there's a fair chance you'll have access to goods that were manufactured hundreds, perhaps even thousands of miles away. Things can become quite common. After the Romans, the odds are that you're using tableware pottery that's been made probably within sight of where you live, certainly within a very small area. Long-distance trade occurs, but on nothing like the same scale. Now, it has been declining in the later Roman period, but nevertheless, there is still a strong change. It isn't uniform, it doesn't happen at one clear date, but it is there. Peter Heather emphasized the threats to the empire, emphasized that the empire was destroyed. He blames it all on the Huns. The Huns create this sort of ripple effect, and they make the Germans start migrating, and through a series of sort of miscalculations, some bits of bad decisions by a few dodgy emperors, then it all goes horribly wrong. But he still claims that the 4th century empire was fundamentally strong, as efficient, if not more efficient, than the Roman Empire had ever been. That's where I have a problem with really the orthodox view, and even some of the critics of that, of the specialists of this period. My main interests have been in earlier Roman history. That's what I've tended to look at. And when I come to look at what they say about the 4th century, its institutions, the government, the army, I simply can't buy it. There seems to be one key element that's missing. And let's go back to another story and another individual, and perhaps this will give you an indication of why I have such a problem with this. Now we're going to the 4th century, so over 100 years before Romulus Augustulus, and we'll look at a chap called Silvanus, who's a general in the Roman army. He happens by blood to be part Frank, from one of these Germanic tribes that's going to create modern France. But he's a Holy Roman officer. Culturally, linguistically, he is a Roman. He's a Roman citizen, he's a member of the Roman army, the Roman administration. He doesn't think any differently from anyone else. Now, in 351 AD, he changed sides in a civil war and defected to the man who won, who became the Emperor Constantius II. Constantius rewards him by giving command of the army in Gaul, really on the Rhine frontier, dealing with raids and attacks from the Germanic tribes. Now, in 355, 4 years later, a minor imperial official goes to Gaul to do with collecting taxes and material, animals, crops, share of the harvest that will be used to support the army and the imperial administration. And this individual goes to Silvanus and asks for letters of recommendation, letters in which the general says to local officials, help this man, he's on the emperor's service, just help him to do his job, make life easier for him. Perfectly normal, natural thing to do. This is how the Roman Empire worked. But then something odd happens, or something unusual, because the official in question rubs out all the text of these letters apart from the signature, and then writes letters of his own that are far more exciting and dramatic, and that suggest that Silvanus is plotting against the Emperor Constantius and wants to raise an army and depose him. This official takes these to friends of his at court, one of whom is the Praetorian prefect, a very senior minister of the emperor, gives them to him. The Praetorian prefect goes to the emperor and says, look, Silvanus is a traitor, he's plotting against you. The Praetorian prefect, through this, shows Constantius what a great guy he is, because look how loyal I am. You know, somebody's plotting and I don't join them, I immediately report them to the emperor so you can deal with this new threat. And so is the official. Everybody gets rewarded, Constantius is pleased. So the emperor immediately starts to order arrests of anybody associated with Silvanus, the general. But Silvanus has friends at court as well. And they go to the emperor and say, look, he's a loyal man, he's a good general, he's a capable officer, he's not guilty of this. So Constantius wonders what the truth is, so he decides to send somebody to Gaul to find out what's going on. The problem is that this man doesn't really have the inclination, can't be bothered to do the detective work to actually discover this. So instead, he goes to Gaul, goes nowhere near Silvanus, but just starts arresting people, confiscating their property, putting them on trial and executing them, and making a very tidy profit for himself, because a large share of the property he's confiscating, he simply pockets. So his reports are, completely useless. The emperor doesn't know what's going on. By this time, Silvanus has been warned by his friends at court that Constantius doesn't trust him. So he's obviously getting pretty nervous. He thinks, how can I prove that I'm loyal? Well, in fact, what he doesn't know, because communications are very slow, information can't pass any quicker than someone can ride a horse. So it takes a long time for reports to get from Gaul back to Italy. But in fact, somebody has looked closely at the letters that have been forged and has realized that there's an imprint of earlier text, earlier characters, underneath what's written there now. They discover that the whole thing is a hoax, that it's a forgery, it's a plot, so that Silvanus isn't guilty. But Silvanus doesn't know he's safe. And he's decided that, well, the emperor doesn't trust me, which means I'm dead. And not just me, but all my family, all my relatives, all my associates, because we're disloyal. So Silvanus, who had no intention at all of rebelling, does rebel. Because, well, it's the only way of surviving. I'm dead anyway, my only chance, I might as well. I've got to depose Constantius. And it's quite interesting. The historian who tells us about this points out several incidents that show that this clearly wasn't premeditated. So, for instance, several days before he actually declares himself emperor, Silvanus goes to his troops, parades them, and distributes gold to them as a reward from Constantius. Now, obviously, if you're plotting against the emperor, you're not going to give a load of money in his name to your troops and then say, well, you don't really like him, though, do you? You've got the cash, it's there in a chest, you give it in your own name. But he doesn't do that. The other thing makes the whole affair a little bit tawdry, really. The whole thing is quite unimpressive. It was a dangerous thing to have in your possession any item of clothing that could be seen as imperial. The emperor is the only person allowed to wear a purple cloak, to wear certain distinctive robes. Having purple material found in your possession could be very dangerous. We hear of one person who's put on trial and tortured and eventually executed for owning a purple tablecloth. There's another case of a man with a hat that was considered to look a little bit too much like one of the imperial caps. And that's enough to have him put on trial and arrested. So Silvanus doesn't have imperial regalia at his disposal, because if he owned them, then everyone would know, the emperor would think that he was disloyal in the first place. So what he has to do is take some of the flags from the Roman army unit standards, some of which were made of purple cloth, and they stitch several of these together to make this sort of rather patchwork quilt-like cloak thing. And Silvanus appears before his troops, and they proclaim him emperor. But he's only got an army of a few thousand men. It's not very big. He hasn't got a large force. His heart clearly isn't in it. So Constantius knows by this time that the letters were faked, that there wasn't a plot. But then news arrives that Silvanus has declared himself emperor. And once somebody's done that, well, he's a rival, you've got to kill him. So Silvanus sends another general who's also under suspicion for disloyalty because he happens to be related to somebody else who's rebelled and isn't trusted, and he's sent there to deal with the problem. He pretends to be a friend of Silvanus, they knew each other, but then starts spreading money around and bribes Silvanus' soldiers, who must have realized that this rebellion wasn't really going anywhere. You know, that Silvanus hasn't organized, he hasn't planned, he's not that keen, so we're probably not going to win. Might be a good time to change sides, especially if somebody's giving us money. So poor old Silvanus is dragged out of church where he's gone for a service and hacked to death by his own men who've proclaimed him emperor just a week or two before. And Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian who was actually present, he's one of the officers who's sent to deal with Silvanus, comments that, "And thus died a general of considerable merit, who had resorted to the most desperate measures to save himself for fear of the calumnies in which he was ensnared during his absence by a faction of his enemies." If you look at an incident like this, it's very hard to argue for an essentially healthy and efficient 4th century empire. Because, you know, what's going on? You've had a man who's felt that his only chance of survival is to rebel, purely because somebody has forged documents incriminating him. And this is really the moral of the wider story. The one thing that appears to be ignored time and time again by the period specialists who look at the later Roman Empire. And that's the frequency of civil war. You've got a situation where the emperor is permanently suspicious, but communications are poor. It's quite difficult for the emperor to find out what is in fact going on in any of the provinces. And he doesn't trust anyone. And the men within the hierarchy, his ministers, his bureaucrats, his army commanders, they know they're not trusted, and they're suspicious of everybody around them. They can't trust their superiors, they can't trust their subordinates, they can't trust their equals. After all, the best way to prove that you're loyal to the emperor is to rat on somebody else. Or to, you know, you can make quite a profit by condemning people, whether or not they were guilty of rebellion. But because if you condemn them, you prove your loyalty. You also stand a very good chance of getting a share of their property when it's confiscated. But there's also a fairly basic thing. If you start to do the simple arithmetic and look at the frequency of civil wars, and from the year 217 AD onwards, right up until Romulus Augustulus, there are only 3 decades without a civil war. It's nearly 250 years, and you only have 3 periods of 10 years without a civil war. That's fairly startling by the standards of most states, and yet it's simply accepted. And you're not just dealing with the actual destruction involved in a civil war. After all, in a civil war, it's the Roman army on both sides. So yes, the Romans are going to win all the battles, but they're also going to lose all the battles. The wars are going to be fought in your own provinces. When you storm a city, it's not some barbarian stronghold, it's not some Persian city, it's a Roman provincial city that you go in and you plunder and you burn to the ground. When armies march through the provinces, they will be eating up the crops of your own farmers. There is no profit. You can't sell slaves from the captives in a civil war. And this is not going to be, this is an expensive thing. Somebody wins, but somebody always loses, and you're both Roman. But it's not just that. It's, again, the ripple effect of these. A civil war might be quite a local affair. It might, like the rebellion of Silvanus, be over in a matter of weeks, not involve any major battles, not involve any serious fighting. But lots of people will still die as a result of it. Anyone connected with Silvanus would be under suspicion. Closely connected people would probably be killed. Your family tends to get executed. Relatives who might be 1,000 or more miles away at the different end of the empire will not be trusted, will probably be arrested, quite probably killed. And the Roman Empire worked on patronage, letters of recommendation. That's how people got jobs. So everybody you've recommended, if you're now condemned, if you lose a civil war, is under suspicion. These are people who owe you an obligation, who owe you a debt for the favor you gave them. They will find themselves under suspicion. They will find themselves arrested. Many will be executed. So there's an effect all the way through that spreads far beyond the actual fighting. And it has a deep cultural impact as well that strangely is missed if you're a cultural historian. After all, perhaps one of the most striking things about all Roman civil wars, and this is true of those of Caesar's day, of the late Republic, as it is of the ones of this period, is that they aren't really fought about anything other than power. There is no ideology involved. There are no different political policies or causes. All you are fighting about is power. Who will be in charge? Who will enjoy the benefits? Who will enjoy the wealth, the prosperity, the sheer power, the glory? So you're not attacking an emperor because of his policies. You might think he's vulnerable because he hasn't been successful, but you're not going to do anything in a fundamentally different way. Seizing power doesn't change anything. So if you're a cultural historian, a civil war is irrelevant because it doesn't change the culture. If you're a religious historian, a civil war doesn't change belief, it doesn't change religion. The empire remains almost identical in every respect after each civil war. So that's one of the reasons why that trend in history has allowed people to ignore these things. But there is a basic cultural change in terms of how emperors thought, how their servants thought. It's based on trust. Emperors cannot trust anybody. An emperor realizes that his most dangerous enemies are not foreign leaders. A barbarian tribe might be able to raid into a Roman province. It might sometimes even be able to seize a bit of territory, but it isn't going to be able to knock the Roman Empire over. Even the Persians, who are a civilized state to the east, are simply not as big, not as prosperous, not as militarily powerful by any stretch of the imagination as Rome. There was never any prospect of a Persian army turning up in Italy. But the Romans could march down the Euphrates and Tigris Valley time after time and burn down the Persian capital. They could not conquer, they failed to conquer Persia, but Persia had not a hope of destroying Rome, or even seriously damaging it. But the real enemy for every emperor are other Romans. Other Romans can kill you and take your job. Those are the people you worry about. So you end up with a situation where the emperor is far more concerned with staying alive and personal success than he is with actually ruling well. And it has implications in how the empire works. The Roman Empire is huge. It dwarfs everyone else out there. It has no competitors or anything like its equal. It has these vast resources right into the early 5th century, and in the eastern half, they're still substantial for a long time after that. And yet, it's very hard to see these working. There's quite an important document called the Notitia Dignitatum that dates to the early 5th century and lists all the offices within the Roman Empire, including all the units within the Roman army and their various commanders. And it's given scholars the impression that there is a vast army in existence, perhaps twice the size of the one that Augustus controlled. But there's a bit of a problem. For instance, in 409 AD, a group of Vandals and some other tribes attack into Spain. They overrun the Spanish peninsula relatively quickly. Now, according to this document, the Notitia, there ought to be 6 regiments of the Roman field army, fairly well-equipped, good professional soldiers waiting there to meet these barbarians. And yet, according to the narratives, there is virtually no resistance, no organized resistance by regular units of the Roman army. It's very hard to find this supposedly huge army. It just doesn't seem to be there. And most modern studies have emphasized how few barbarians there probably were in these tribal groups that force their way in the war bands that are able to set up kingdoms. But they don't see the consequence of that, hang on a minute, if there's lots of these Roman soldiers and there's not many barbarians, how come the barbarians keep winning? You get some very strange things where in 376, a group of migrating Goths arrive on the River Danube, and one group's allowed into the empire and then treated so badly they rebel. Another group joins them, forces their way in fairly soon afterwards. Now, the best studies of this recently have tended to, it's still guesswork, but they've estimated the number of warriors in the Gothic army as about maybe 20,000 men altogether. It's not a very big force. This is at a time when we're claiming the Roman army on paper and throughout the empire numbers maybe 650,000. And you've got 20,000 Goths go in. It takes the combined resources of both Eastern and Western Empire 6 years to defeat a group of desperate migrants who haven't got a home to return to because they've been driven out by the Huns. In those 6 years, the Roman army, the professional, organized, disciplined Roman army, fights 4 major battles, and it loses 3 of them and only manages a draw in the 4th. It's something that really doesn't add up. This is not the same sort of context you have as the wars of Caesar's day. And yet if you look at how the way the barbarians are described, the way they fight, their numbers, nothing seems to have changed. In fact, if anything, the armies are smaller than they had been in earlier periods. Rome has these resources, but it cannot direct them to solve a problem of this sort. it wins in the end because it can't lose. 20,000 migrating Goths cannot destroy the Roman Empire. They cannot win. The best they can hope for is an honourable peace and being given land to settle on. But you have a situation where the emperor's first priority has become personal survival, and the empire becomes structured around this. Back in Augustus's day, one person would be in charge of an entire province. He'd be an imperial legate, he'd be supreme military commander in that area, he'd also be the supreme civil authority and the supreme judicial authority. By the time you get to the late 3rd century, one province in the earlier period would have been divided into 4 or perhaps 5 smaller regions. In each of those regions, there isn't, even in those smaller areas, one man in charge. You have a completely separate military command structure, a separate political and civil command structure. And they're kept very distinct, and they don't tend to cooperate very well. Now, part of the idea of this is not about making the empire more efficient, but it's an emperor who doesn't want to trust anybody with as much power as the provincial governors had had in the earlier periods, because they're the people who'd been rebelling from the 3rd century onwards, making themselves emperors. So you don't trust anybody, with enough power to do anything, which is fine until there's a problem, because then it means nobody can solve it, unless the emperor goes to the spot himself. Because if he appoints a special commander and sends him there, he doesn't trust him, and that man will probably rebel, because he knows that the emperor doesn't trust him anyway, so he's going to be treated fairly dodgily anyway. But this is one of the reasons why you have more than one emperor. It's because the emperor obviously can't be in 2 places at the same time. But that still doesn't solve the problem that even if you have 4 emperors, there are quite often more than 4 problems to deal with. And an area that doesn't have its problems dealt with, that doesn't have an emperor on the spot, will often appoint one because it thinks, well, that's the only way we can deal with a threat from barbarians or whatever it may be. So in the end, there is this chronic instability at the heart of the Roman state, a suspicion. There is no incentive to make an emperor rule well, to make his ministers, his bureaucrats, his soldiers do their job efficiently, because that is no sure path to survival. There are other ways to play the game to be personally successful than actually being good at your job. And in fact, you don't want to be too good because then you're treated with suspicion. Now, obviously, there are many other factors involved as well, but they're difficult to measure. There are clearly major economic problems in the 3rd century and later on. Coinage is devalued on quite a staggering scale. There may well be significant drops in population. There may well be other sorts of economic and problems with agriculture. But we face one big difficulty when we come to all of these things. The evidence is not there. We simply do not have a statistical base on which we have any hope at all of measuring the Roman economy and measuring any changes within it. We do not have that information. And scholars have looked at exactly the same evidence, and some have depicted appalling economic decline, appalling hardship, decay in the 3rd into the 4th centuries. Others will look at the same thing and swear blind that everything is perfect and that things are great. You do get some fairly crude measures in terms of shipwrecks of trading vessels that show pottery from the amphitheatre that were the main containers. Those are much more common, the finds from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, than they are later on. Suggests some change. At an even more basic level, when they did some analysis of traces of pollution in the polar ice caps a few years back, they discovered that the Romans were polluting in the 1st and 2nd centuries at levels that weren't matched again until the late 18th, early 19th century. And that's traces of iron smelting industry in general. So, again, that's the 1st, 2nd centuries AD. There is a drop later on. It's still quite significant. It's still more than would follow, but nevertheless, there are traces of decline. But all of these things are extremely difficult to measure because we don't have the evidence. And there are reasons why the empire becomes less stable that I don't really have time to go into. But in the end, if you come back to this thing which we can measure, the frequency of civil war is so obvious and yet seems to be ignored. And it's something that saps and rots the efficiency of the empire. Even if all these other problems are real, and I suspect many of them were, the empire was far less able to deal with them. Because in the end, government became purely about survival and personal success and personal profit. But the basic truth of Rome, that we hinted at right back at the beginning, is that it was big. It is far bigger, it is far wealthier, it is far more sophisticated than anybody else out there. anyone else with whom it's in contact. So it can't fail for a very long time. That's why it can endure 2.5 centuries of near constant civil war. And it takes that time before just the Western Empire goes, and the Eastern Empire becomes a lot more stable afterwards and survives for another 1,000 years. Rome is so big that it can't get hurt. So it's perhaps in things like that that we can gain whatever lessons we might want for the modern world. It's a very dangerous thing to go to the past looking for lessons for the present day, because if you go looking for something, you're almost bound to find them. But you tend just to confirm your own prejudices, your own assumptions. If you're going to do history properly, if you're going to learn from history, you need to understand it on its own terms first. You need to look at Roman history in its own context and understand that. And if you look at the context of Rome, then the conditions compared to the present day are so staggeringly different. You know, people might talk about America as the new Rome, but, you know, you're not having civil wars every 5 minutes. You know, when McCain lost the election last year, he didn't go back to Arizona, raise an army, and march on Washington. I mean, it's not conceivable that this sort of thing would happen. You're not poisoning the emperor when you get the opportunity, you know. I mean, things are very different. Sometimes I had to do a paper on strategy for the army just recently. And one of the things you have to begin is by saying there are lots of things that, well, the Romans did and worked for them, but that you definitely couldn't and wouldn't want to do in the modern world. You know, you can't go into a village, burn it down and crucify everybody, slave the population and sell them. You know, it's not going to look good on CNN. The Romans didn't have this problem. They could be nasty as much as they liked. And there were many aspects of Roman culture that makes you very glad they're not around and that they did decline and fall. But one lesson that perhaps is there is that when an institution or a country or a government becomes so large and successful that it faces no equal competitor, then it can survive off its fat for a very long time, even if it isn't efficient. You know, it isn't obvious that things aren't working, because you're just so big, you're going to win, you're going to prosper anyway. And if its leaders forget what they're there for, forget the ultimate purpose of government, forget the wider good of the state or the company or the bureaucracy or whatever it is, then it's unlikely in the long term to be a good thing. Again, it might not be obvious for a very long time because you're so big that, you know, nobody can hurt you. But in the end, when a crisis comes, you will not deal with it. And you will have these periodic abrupt collapses where things will go badly wrong, you'll lose territory, the empire will shrink, but then afterwards you'll sort of ignore it and you'll keep on doing the same thing till another crisis comes along a generation later. So you could look at that and you could see parallels with a lot of modern institutions. I must confess, and I'll finish with this, when I first wrote the conclusion for the book, it turned into this appalling rant about the state of Britain today that I sat back and read and rather surprised myself, and then thought I'd better go and have a cold shower, and I rewrote it. So there is a danger for all of us to make the past fit our own depressed instincts at the time. But there are certainly lessons from Roman history, and I think it's those general ones that are about how human beings behave. Those are the things where you can find the parallel rather than the specifics of history. So, having said that this is one of the great questions of history, that starting off with 200-odd reasons as different explanations, there in about 50-odd minutes I've tried to solve all those problems for you and sort it out and give you a simple answer. So, there we are. Thank you very much for coming. Yes, please, if anybody would like to.
I want to remind everybody that the book, How Rome Fell, is for sale from our friends at Barnes & Noble. And Mr. Goldsworthy, I think, will sign books afterwards.
We do, yes. The only thing I will have to warn people is that the signature will not look the same in two books. I haven't yet mastered one that used to be a right pain when I was writing checks, because people would look at them and think, well, is that you? Anyway, sorry, the gentleman in front of me.
Sounds like a lot of what you're describing is that the Romans themselves stopped thinking of themselves as Romans, or stopped believing in the idea of Rome.
Yes, I mean, there's an element where it's certainly the idea of what Rome is changes, but there's something else that underlies this. They stop thinking about it and they stop believing, but part of that is because they cannot imagine a world without Rome. I mean, one of the most striking contrasts with the Roman experience to, for instance, the end of empires in the 20th century is that you don't have this great wave of nationalism. You know, people in Spain in the 5th century don't want to be Spaniards. People in Gaul don't want to be Gauls. You might find that you set up a local emperor, but you still want to be Roman. Rome means civilization. Rome means this superior lifestyle, this making you part of this much broader culture, this literature, this tradition. And there isn't really any alternative, or certainly nothing that looks very attractive. So there's almost a complacency as well, that we don't have to prove we're Roman, because, well, we're bound to succeed. I mean, obviously you can see this reflected in things like with St. Augustine writing The City of God, as a response to the sack of Rome, which just shocked people. You know, even living in North Africa, people who'd never been to Rome, never likely to, and Rome itself had ceased to be politically important by this point, but as an idea, it troubled people that Rome could end, because they found it very hard to imagine a world without that. So it's a mixture. There is a change, but what they're certainly not doing is working and thinking that we have to be such good Romans, we have to be such traditional Romans. But there's, again, culturally, styles of literature become far more archaic, and you have lots of senators writing this interminable stuff trying to prove just how Roman and literate they are. So it's a strange mixture of all these things, but they're not going into politics. So it's service to the state, or proving you're Roman doesn't mean what it meant for a senator under Augustus, which meant public service. So that's certainly a change. Yes, gentleman at the back there. Oh, sorry, yes. Apart from the technological advances, which are obviously fairly clear and many, what are the main differences between... You interested mainly with the Republic and... Right. Well, I mean, there's little things like sort of, you allow women to vote and public office and this sort of thing. You even give them more than one name, which the Romans struggled with. If you were the daughter of someone, all you got was the feminine form of their name. A man gets 3 names, a woman only gets 1. And all your daughters get the same name, and then you number them officially. So you get Julia 1, Julia 2, Julia 3. Privately, you had to give them some name, otherwise... could you pass the salt, please, Julia, became a terribly controversial question at dinner. So there's obviously lots of society things. As an institution, one thing that probably more than anything else, and has a relevance today, because it does affect how policy is conducted, particularly in the military sphere, is that in Roman society and in the Roman Republic, civil and military power were not separated. The same people led the state in war as led it in peace. If you're elected to be consul, one of the senior magistrates of the Roman Republic, you will expect, after doing all your civil jobs, to go off and lead an army and fight somebody. Oh, there's no concept at all of anything outside Rome. Nobody else, as far as the Romans are concerned, nobody has rights other than them. The Romans are bound by law, but there isn't nobody else out there. There are lots of foreigners, but they're never your equal. So that's a different thing. There aren't... and Rome can dominate the world in a way. But as an institution, Rome politically, the same people control the army, fight the wars, as decide why a war is fought. Whereas obviously in America, again, this is really from 17th century England onwards and the civil wars there, military power and civil authority is kept very clearly separate. The idea was not to have a repetition of Cromwell and the rule of the major generals in the English Civil War, where you basically have a military dictatorship. The religious, again, is different in that it is an important part of the state system. So again, the same people that are your consuls are probably also your senior priests. I mean, Julius Caesar, who does not strike you as a terribly religious man when you read about him, was the Pontifex Maximus. That's the title the Pope now has. It's the senior priest of all Rome in charge of regulating the different aspects of the state cult. But religion surrounded everything. It was sacrifice to find out what was going on, days within the calendar when you could do public business, when you could begin a campaign, all of these things. It was absolutely everywhere. But it was closely linked. It's all part of the same structure. So there is it right at the heart of the state. You've got political leadership, military, religious. Everything is done by the same people in the same group. Under the Republic. And there is freedom to do whatever you like as long as you abide by the state religion when necessary. And that's something that continues for quite a long time. Even... Sorry, beg your pardon? Yeah, that's going to be perhaps I better answer some others otherwise, because this could take quite a while. But thank you anyway. Sorry, I can't remember who was next. So if I start at the front and work back, if that's okay.
We've made comparisons to the British Empire and the United States. Has anyone authoritatively made a comparison to China and its emperor and history?
Not so much, because it's one of those things, it's a disciplinary thing, in that the people who have the linguistic skills and the knowledge to study China well don't have the same skills to study Rome and vice versa. I mean, the Romans were dimly aware that the Chinese Empire was out there, and the Chinese were dimly aware that the Romans were out there, and there is some long-distance trade. There's regular trade to India and Sri Lanka from Rome, but some stuff is coming even further. And in the middle of the 2nd century, a group of Roman merchants turn up at the Chinese capital, claiming to be representatives of the Roman emperor, and they just obviously want some trade concession, and the odds are they're just pretending. And at one point, the Chinese try and send a delegation to Rome, but they're persuaded by the Parthians that it's just too far away, because the Parthians were doing very well as middlemen, levying tolls on goods that passed through. So you didn't want to tell people that actually, well, you could take it there yourself if you wanted to, and you could negotiate directly. But there are a lot of similarities. The difference with the Chinese Empire is that it is much more geographically coherent and culturally so. The strange thing about the Roman Empire is that it's centered on a sea. The Mediterranean is at the heart of it. And the Romans are, in fact, the only state in all of history to control all the lands around the Mediterranean. No one's ever done that, even today. So that does create a different system. But there's actually, informally, if you talk to the experts on China at scholars or vice versa, we both get a sense that there's lots of very similar things going on. Because, again, the technological limitations aren't that different, and it tends to make the state, you've got the problems of communication and the slow thing. But China survives as something that is more obviously and consistently Chinese. So they have a success in that respect, but it does fluctuate between the different dynasties, and obviously politically things change. But I think it's a book that I'd love to read, done really well, but I know I can't do it, because I just don't have the knowledge, and there aren't, hopefully someone along the line, there'll be someone crazy enough to really study for long enough to do both well. But at the moment it just tends to be done in more general ways. So, sorry, yes, gentlemen. Oh, but I'll come to you in a minute, yeah. I would say, the lessons you can learn from Roman history for modern application and for avoiding the mistakes they're much more general, and they're more to do with the culture of government and the way things work, in that you need to keep, and particularly within a democracy, you need to keep reminding the elected representatives what they're there for. And that it isn't for their own personal career and to make themselves safe, comfortable, get re-elected, and make a profit. Which they can do, and you can end up existing. Obviously, the modern parallel would be existing within, the sort of Washington little separate society of its own. All you really talk to, all you really know about are the lobby groups that are permanently there, that are permanently shouting. You deal with them. You don't have to go back and deal with voters or care really what much they think, because so often people will anyway vote along from traditional party lines. You always vote for this party or that, or you can see demographically certain areas will always elect someone of that sort. If you end up forgetting what you're there for, then that's the danger. That's when things go wrong. But the warning of Rome is that it might not be obvious until it's far too late that that's gone wrong, because you can have a successful career. People did in the 4th into the 5th centuries. Some people became phenomenally wealthy, did very well, were extremely distinguished, but were never any good at doing anything. And that is certainly a danger. I can speak with more direct knowledge of my own country, where another rather unpleasant lesson is It's a little bit simplistic and it's slightly crude, but if you look at the Empire of Augustus, or even into the 2nd century, there were maybe 1,000 bureaucrats, civil servants, at a fairly generous estimate within the entire Roman Empire. By the end of the 3rd century, there's about 35,000 of them, but they achieve less. And there's a remarkable thing, especially in Britain, where things go to quite an extreme degree, where obviously there's a lot of debate about health service and that sort of reform there, but there is quite a staggering statistic in terms of Britain's health service, is that the number of hospital beds has steadily declined as the number of administrators has increased over the years, and it keeps on, and it costs more and more money. And every time you throw money at this problem, the problem being is that if you make someone, if they are in charge of an administrative department, in theory they should remember that what we're here to do is to serve the function of that hospital or that system or providing medical care here and make that work. But what you see on a day-to-day timescale is what's on your desk. And you're more concerned about what's happening in your office and so you tend to think of your problems, they absorb you. That's what you see. This is just human nature. And it is very easy to forget why you're there. And you can think about, well, if my department's got a bigger budget, I could do more things. I could produce more paperwork, and wouldn't that be great? Which would mean we need even more people to process it. And that can be seen as progress, and you've forgotten that you were actually there to serve a completely different purpose. As I say, my initial, when I wrote the early conclusion of this, were an appalling rant about the state of Britain as it is now. And it is particularly depressing, and it's even worse if you go to things like the European Union, where goodness knows what they're doing half the time. But there was, for instance, a case a couple of years back. A failed politician from Britain got sent to be one of the major bureaucrats in Brussels, put in charge of a department. Now, I worked at the university where this chap had been educated, and many people in the department who basically said, one of the nicest people you could ever meet, but thick as 2 short planks and didn't do any work. But he was nice and he agreed with everybody, so he kept getting promoted. He'd failed in politics. He then went to Brussels and was sacked from his department because it was found guilty of staggering corruption and incompetence. And then, this being Brussels, 48 hours later, he and all his officials were reappointed in exactly the same jobs, because that's the way they were Britain's share, and Britain had to have so many officials doing this sort of thing. You end up with this strange sort of surreal way of thinking that... So anyway, sorry, I've started to go into rant mode again, so I better stop it and ask the gentleman there who had his hand up.
So is your overall sense then that what happened to Rome was pretty much inevitable, or do you find yourself thinking that certain times, well, if only emperors so-and-so had done this or that thing?
There is a major change. So the question of whether Rome's decline, whether this process is inevitable or not, there certainly obviously must have been a stage they reached where it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to go back. One big difference is when the Senate is marginalized. Although Augustus, when he creates the imperial system, it's basically a military dictatorship. But it is a veiled military dictatorship. It pretends to be a sort of constitutional, but it pretends not to be a monarchy at all. But the emperor makes the laws, but he is also bound by the laws. The emperor pretends to be he wants to be seen as the servant of the state. He also uses the Senate, the people who'd been the political leaders of the Republic, the ones who'd held political office, who'd been elected. He keeps those same families or people like them, and he uses them as his main representatives. They're the people who govern provinces. Now, that means that the only people who can be considered potential emperors are also senators. Now, that means that the emperor knows where any rivals may come from. There's only 600 senators. There's maybe only a dozen or so who could be considered potentially emperors. It's a lot easier politically to watch those people, to keep an eye on them. But when you get the spate of civil wars early on in the late 2nd, early 3rd centuries, those emperors are insecure and they marginalize the Senate. They don't trust senators at all, so they start using people from a lower social status, the next class down, and they give them command of armies, they give them command of provinces. The idea is to make themselves safer. But the paradox is that as soon as you control an army, well, you can in fact rebel. And so these people who are the next social class, the equestrian order, the knights, become emperors. Now, there are probably tens of thousands of equestrians out there. You can't possibly watch all these people. It means that suddenly it's very easy to become emperor, but it's much harder to stay emperor. So that's a fairly dramatic political shift that occurs within a generation or so. And they never again achieve the same level of stability. And even having Rome as a capital, Rome as a center, gave the empire some form of unity that it loses when emperors start spending time elsewhere, when people move away, when they're itinerant. Having a Senate, having Rome, having somewhere where everyone came back to for different stages of their career, gave the empire unity. It's what the Eastern Empire regains when the West has gone. Constantinople has that. It is a center. The emperor starts remaining there. The emperor doesn't go off on campaign very often, and it works much better. The older system, in many ways, was far more efficient. Sorry, I better...
Maybe take two more questions.
Two more questions. So I better come over in this direction because I've been looking there. I did a talk of 6 months ago, and there was one poor lady sitting about 3 feet away from me, right in front of me. I apparently ignored for 25 minutes in all the questions. So sorry I've done that to him. But yes, sorry.
Well, I ran across a name here that was familiar to me, and it's Zenobia. And she's a very powerful woman in what I read in your book. But we haven't touched on women in Rome and powerful women there.
That's, again, it's...
It seemed to me that everyone with power in Rome had money, which hasn't changed in history. But I would like to hear what you have to say about Zenobia.
Zenobia is a truly intriguing figure, and she's someone we'd love to know more about. She's the Queen of Palmyra, which is out. It's an oasis city. It's one of the staging posts. It has water, and it's along the Silk Road, so it gains power, wealth, prominence because of that. These are the great families of Palmyra run caravans through the desert, and they protect them and guard them so they can get goods through, and they make a profit on that basis. It's a strange thing. People sometimes see Zenobia as very much this sort of Eastern queen who stands up to the Romans, rebels against them. But although she does that, really, the conflict she's fighting is a civil war. She is a Roman citizen. Her husband was a Roman citizen, a Roman governor. He is also named King of Palmyra, but he is a Roman official more than anything else. But she's quite interesting because she does all sorts of things like revive the memory of Cleopatra, which clearly is a name that still has power. But she's not interested in making herself ruler. It's about making her son initially replacement to succeed to his father's power, which is not normal for a governor to sort of pass his power on, but then eventually to make him emperor. So what she's aiming at is imperial rule of the entire empire. But she's just one. I mean, she's one of the more dramatic individuals. The rebellion fails, but although she's taken prisoner, she's not executed. And there's a rather nice tradition that she's married to a senator and that the family goes on for generations in Rome and is still quite important. The problem is this is from the latter part of the 3rd century when the evidence is so abysmally bad that we really don't know what's going on. But even before that, you have the women of the family of Septimius Severus, who fights his way to imperial power eventually by 197. But if you remember the movie Gladiator, you've got Commodus at the end, who lasts, I think, something about an hour and 20 minutes, doesn't he, in the film, before a Russell Crowe polishes him off in the Colosseum. Well, in fact, he ruled for 12 years and gets strangled in his bath, but, it's Hollywood's allowed its liberty. There's another period of instability after him, but Severus is the man who eventually wins after that dynasty is over. His wife is an extremely influential character, both in his lifetime, but also after he's died. And then, not just his wife, but her sister they make emperors. And there's even a stage where one of them, the sister, is taking part in meetings of the Senate. And sometimes there's one tradition that has her doing it sort of privately. She has a curtain, and she's sort of sitting behind this curtain, pretending not to be there, but listening in and trying to make sure that... So it is another one of those fascinating topics, but it's a very big topic, so I probably can't go much beyond that. And then one last... gentleman there in front of me.
What century did Rome invade England? And what did they find? Villages of hundreds or cities of thousands?
Julius Caesar goes to Britain twice, but only really stays for a couple of months in the middle of the 1st century BC. But he does Roman trade with Britain, then hugely increases afterwards. The conquest begins in AD 43 with the Emperor Claudius, that maybe is familiar from the old I, Claudius, whether the BBC or the Graves novel. Who needs military glory and sees Britain as the place to do it. They then stay there for 3.5 centuries. What they find when they get there we used to think of as something quite undeveloped, but it's now becoming more and more clear archaeologically that between Caesar and the arrival of Claudius, that particularly the peoples of the southeast have developed some very large kingdoms. There are substantial towns, perhaps if not cities. It's the same process you can see elsewhere. I mean, a lot of the towns that were in Gaul before Caesar attacks it are quite sophisticated settlements that are turning into something very similar to the city-states of Greece and Rome. You know, they seem to be going along that line. Britain maybe isn't quite as far in that direction, and the northern areas, the western areas, tend to be a bit more primitive. Some of the areas there, you seem to just get this settlement pattern that just doesn't like even villages. It's something you can see, for instance, in some parts of South Africa today, where what you'll see is a family homestead, and it'll be 3 or 4 houses, there'll be a little kraal for half a dozen cattle, and then there'll be another one just 200 yards away, and another one. There isn't ever one single nucleated settlement, but it sort of scatters around. That's something you see very much in Iron Age Britain. And normally archaeologists come to it and think, well, we see all these little round houses, all these little groups of villages. Is it that you have one family that moves, you know, for 20 years it lives there, then that house gets a bit unpleasant, you know, thatch roofs after a while do decay, so you just move a little bit. Personally, I suspect they're wrong. I think the population is much bigger and is already developed. Certainly from the environmental archaeology, it's quite clear that large parts of the forests in Britain had already been removed before, had already been chopped down and cleared and developed into arable land before the Romans got there. In fact, there's even a slight sort of irony in that by the 1st century AD, Britain was exporting grain to the Roman Empire, and that grain was probably going to feed many of the Roman troops stationed on the Rhine, who will be sent to go and conquer Britain. So in the same way that the British chieftains, their power, one of the things that's allowing them to develop into these larger kingdoms and states is having access to the luxury goods that come in from the Roman Empire. London, what will become London, the trading settlement, that's a Roman trading settlement, was established before the Roman province. So there's a Roman community living in Britain when Britain is still independent. It's not part of the Roman Empire. And that's true. It's a pattern you had repeated in many other areas before. So trade usually moves far in advance of the legions, but it doesn't get talked about so much. It's something we can see more archaeologically. But it's not, the histories are concerned with the great events, the great leaders, the aristocracy. But there's lots of people out there, there's lots of entrepreneurs out there who are spreading Roman ideas and sort of prepare the way for a further exploitation of the market when the Romans develop. So it's a mixture, but the pattern is changing as we see the evidence and develops archaeologically.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank you.